Henry, I don't know if you want to take a moment just to say something in response, but I'm very keen that we take comments and thoughts from the audience as well.
Yeah.
So if you would like to say anything in response,
We'll be very brief. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks to both Sarah and Colin for your extremely helpful and constructive readings. On Sarah's point, I take the most important sort of pointer that perhaps the whole idea that theory is important if you want to engage in political interventions. I think I take that as a singular biggest idea and, from the specific points you mentioned and projects. And of course, we do face then, if that's the case, the practical difficulty of how to, if you like, develop the kind of theory that are useful in our actual interventions. And to respond, also connect back to partly what Colin talked about. I think probably your last point is that actually when I wrote this book, I had a huge sort of urge in terms of fighting against the kind of anti-intellectualism in certain parts of the world. I mean, because I live in Asia, so Asia has a huge respect for intellectuals, for too much actually. But in the, such like, I'm a professor who is supposed to drive carefully, as you know. So I face tremendous difficulty living in Singapore as a dangerous driver. Anyway, I talk about the US, right? Anti-intellectualism is so bad, and I think it's really imperative on us to kind of bring intellectuals back into the agenda, so to say, agenda setting even better. Yeah. So it's in that spirit that I take Sarah's comments in your full package. Colin has 3 points. I won't go through each of them, but just to say that your reading is a kind of perfectly reasonable reading of some aspects of the book, which now upon reflection, we talked about this in the past, I should have been I would argue probably a bit more careful in some of the words I've chosen. Sometimes I went a bit too wild, basically, in some of the part. This is a problem of writing books rather than journal articles. Journal articles are so short, so compressed. You tend to, be very economical on every word. The books, we have space, so we end up, meandering a little bit. So some of those statements, exact words you have plucked out from the book, I'm afraid those quotable words, sometimes I might have gone overboard. So I think in retrospect, just like what Spivak talked about, that would be the inadvisable omission or mistake that I made. So I think I take them in full spirit. If I have a chance to revise the book to the new edition, I will trim and recast some of those statements. But I think in terms of my own reading of geography's state of play today, because I'm a really thoroughbred geography trained person all the way from secondary to A-level geography to NUS undergrad, PhD, I'm geography all the way in my whole life. Right? I don't want to be an economist. So in that spirit, I do feel that our discipline has come a long way, and hence is a lot more diversified today than what it is. So the question is, how do you read that diversification? I read it as a little bit fragmented, but there are those of you who read it as, the kind of thousands flowers bloom kind of. So it's a slightly different interpretation of probably the same phenomenon. I read our diversity as a little bit perhaps too far stretched. So I'm not asking for one singular core, but perhaps there is some sort of space for us to rethink what are the sort of common areas, topics that geography or human geographers at least can come together and do. So it's in that spirit. So thanks a lot. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Henry.
Right.
Okay, over to you all for questions, comments for Henry.
To your point about exporting theories, I think, at least in the United States context, geography is not thought of as a field that is quote productive. And most of the universities, people think of economics, political science, sociology, and then at the bottom of the list they're geography, which is where things are located. Which obviously as geographers we know. As geographers we know geography is not just where things are located, it's also about reading the landscape and making sense of things as they are. So I was wondering, with this book and with your thinking, it seems like maybe geography needs more of a public image retrofitting today, or maybe a development in its ability to interact with people, because at least again going back to the United States, when you talk about Marx or mostly just Marx and anyone who's relied on his criticisms. People scream and yell and screech, and it becomes very, very hard to provide a policy suggestion to resolve, a social issue or a political issue or anything like that, or like even an analysis, which might be, go back to your point about anti-intellectualism. But do you have any comments on that in terms of like the public image of geography as a whole?
In America.
Well, not just
We're in Britain now, so given the time, we can just go on and
I think
no problem.
I think we. I think we'll take them each individually. But if you feel that there's a comment that you don't want to respond to, then that's absolutely fine. And just have it as part of our general conversation. So, Harriet.
Thank you. Yeah, I had another sort of take on the export ideas. I tend to hang around with a lot of American environmental political scientists who are a little bit sick of how much export of geography there is into their discipline. But that may just be something I have to be responsible for. But so I do think that relationship between geography and other disciplines is very contextual. It's very conditioned by different kinds of areas of the field and how far geography is integrated with other kinds of approaches or otherwise. In urban studies, in some areas in environmental studies, geography is very much kind of mixed into sociology, political science and international relations. Maybe elsewhere it's not. But so that's kind of a comment, and thanks for bringing that up. But the question that I wanted to ask you about is, I'll try to be brief about it because you have made me think a lot. And I was interested in Sarah's comments as well in response to the chapter. Sarah talks a lot about the kind of messy middle of theorizing, but the kind of idea of mess is never really in the chapter, at least that we've read or shared, and I haven't had a chance to look at the rest of the book. And I get somehow the impression from the work that you're seeking this kind of more clarity and cleanliness and a bit of kind of tidying up. I'm kind of in spring cleaning mode myself at the moment here in the UK, with the winter just going away. So I got a sense that what you were looking for was actually to reduce the messiness of that theorizing. And I'm wondering whether that's possible, partly because of occupying the middle range of theory, which I think, as Sarah said, is inevitably a kind of iterative and quite messy process. But also, and perhaps more fundamentally, and where my question is really placed, is about whether the world that we're theorizing is the same. And so one of the things that I'm doing in my work at the moment is thinking about the relationship between knowledge and action. And we have, most theories assume that knowledge precedes action, but the empirical evidence in my area of work shows it's actually the other way around, that action precedes knowledge. And that means that most structural theories or many kind of mid-range theoretical explanations for how we act in the world are actually no longer adequate. And indeed, it is only post-structural theory that provides an explanation. It actually provides a causal explanation of what's going on. And so, so that is part of what we see in the theorization in geography, a reflection of what people are encountering in the world, rather than bringing multitudes of kind of philosophical envy towards a world that stayed the same. And if that is the case, then can we get back to a kind of cleansing out of theory, or are we going to have to cope with more kind of messiness in our theoretical landscape? Sorry, but that's just, I've just been thinking all the way through since reading this chapter yesterday, and so that's, thank you for any reflections you might have.
Thank you. I think I will come back to the US geography method later, okay? But just to respond immediately to Harold's point about messy theorizing, action precedes theory/knowledge, is to say, I think there are aspects of empirical happenings that are kind of a bit more long-term, a bit less kind of rapid, disruptive in nature, that the kind of traditional way of theorizing can work. But, for example, you deal with environmental climate change matter, which kind of happens disruptively, probably can be on daily basis. So in that sense, it's entirely possible that action precedes knowledge accumulation and development. In fact, action has to be built into the theorization process. But going back to also Sarah's point earlier about messy theorizing, is that the theorization process in itself takes time, and depending on the nature of our research, some of us, I don't really do participation research, but there are those of you who are more participatory in nature, in terms of your research. You work with the community, the policymakers, the actual communities, and so on. That then the theorization process may also entail the joining of others, those of collaborators and so on. And hence, there is not a single theory you can talk about because it's a body of knowledge pulled together. So, and that will be a different kind of theory from the sort if you like, engage in this book. Now, this book deals with existing theories which really has been named theories that is really well accepted due to a large body of work, whether the original seminal work, whether in feminist theory or actor network theory already published, and of course, the adapters, means those of us who have adopted it, and hence consolidate its role in knowledge accumulation as a theory. And that's why the name is known as theory. So it means they have gone through the messy process already. Normally take decades. And because of that, question is that are those theories explanatory enough? So that's really the purpose of the book, is to look at the existing theories that have been so-called accepted, developed already. But yes, I think our discussion here is to reflect on perhaps even that messy process of theory development, which I completely agree. In my own experience, it takes, unfortunately, theory cannot be developed overnight. Or maybe fortunately, otherwise all of us are theorists. And then of course, as I argue in the book, that is great in our discipline, at least for human geography, and hence going back to I suppose you're an American student from the US, is that in geography, the good news is that we don't have pure theory heads. We don't even have journal called Journal of Geographical Theory, all right? But in sociology, in poli science, in economics, there are journals explicitly called economic theory, sociological theory, and multiple, not just one. And political science, political theory. They are explicit publication outlets which are completely theory only. For human geography, which journal is pure theory? Don't have. Do we have? We don't. EPF is the newest, Environment Planning F, but not really, right? Apart from that, no, we don't have a geographic theory. Do we have a journal called that? Don't have. So the good news is that we have, or at least geographers, we have always been doing, if you like, research and theory together rather than pure theory. So that's good news. And hence, I think messy theorizing, we are so used to it, embracing it. But at the end of the day, we do have to ask ourselves, and hence the original question, why is geography, or at least human geography, less known in America than GIS, let's say, right? So American geography is known as GIS. It's terrible. Of course not. But of course, on the other hand, American academia tends to be driven by certain kind of social science disciplines that actually run America, which is either the economists or the political scientists, not even the sociologists. Yeah. So because of that, I feel that the reason why they can do that is obviously they have certain kind of theory that drive American thinking, right? Political science is very influential in American politics because it has a certain way of thinking about what democracy is about, which has a certain theoretical underpinning, of course. But we don't do that in human geography, which is, on the one hand, a disadvantage in the US context. On the other hand, I think it's great because then we exactly can embrace the diversity, the experimentation that we do. So I cannot give you a conclusive answer. We are here collectively brainstorming both about our own practices of the future of our discipline. We can't navel gaze what geography will happen in America because that one is another story. It's a bit difficult to tell. But I think in Britain we still have when I say we means I want to be part of British geography. So we hold the future of our discipline. The American geography is a bit iffy. So on that one.
We've got Ash.
Ash, yeah.
Thank you. Henry, I too found your book really very stimulating, and it's, I can see that a huge amount of work has gone into it. But I've also got some of the misgivings that Colin expressed, and I'll tell you which one my specific one is. I share your criticisms, Colin. And it's this, that if we were to ask ourselves, why did the humanities and the social sciences have such things as the feminist term, post-colonial thinking, and all the kind of bodies of work that you vaguely sympathize with but generally criticize? I think just a small proportion of that term had to do with hanging out with the philosophers. Quite a lot of it was political. And it was a way of saying that the abstractions that are at hand and the modes of explanation that are at hand are inadequate. And they don't get to those processes, dare I say also structures, that recursively reproduce power, violence, hate, exclusion, and the rest. So in a sense, these were bodies of thought that emerged explicitly to make sense in ways that other bodies of thought had failed to, or had generalized about, and were not in any way emancipatory. Nor did they actually touch the issues that really mattered for the lives that are led in the spaces that are abandoned, for instance. So I think in these bodies of work, explication was at the very heart of what was being tried. And I think it involved conceptual experimentation of necessity, theoretical opening up of necessity. And if it didn't all, fall into a neat kind of epistemological package of the kind that you're trying to get us to accept and acknowledge, that there was a very specific reason for it. So, when you close your talk by saying exporting, talking back, they were exporting, they were talking back. They just happened to be not your mode of thinking. So I think, and the reason why I'm saying that is because, had you come to your defense of critical realism, and in my book, critical realism is a mile away from speculative realism, actually. But that's just a parenthesis. Then there would be not just more respect for those bodies of thought, but actually they're your allies. Because you go through any one of those bodies of thought, each one is looking for mechanisms, but accepting that these mechanisms change with rapidity, looking for causality by saying that there are certain ways in which we may be able to learn to see in the dark, and perhaps they're slightly agnostic about how mechanisms coalesce or not. But I'm kind of saying they're on the same territory as yours, and you've, I think, discredited them much more than you should.
Thanks, actually. I mean,
I say it in this way because your book is a provocation.
Yeah. No. I mean, I take it in a very positive stride. Actually, not to worry is that, in fact, I take it as a very useful reading that you mentioned, that in many of these other approaches I talked about in this book, they are, whether explicitly or explicitly, also thinking of, if you like, explanatory mechanisms. Let's call it. You don't have to use the term causal mechanism and so on. By the way, I do want to clarify that I didn't really want this book to be read as a kind of bringing critical realism back to human geography, that kind of thing. It wasn't. But on the other hand, to clarify this concept of device known as causal mechanism, it's almost necessary to bring back one of the philosophical approaches that tend to talk more about what causal mechanism is about. So, and also the idea of a mechanism thinking in sociology and certain kind of political science also went all the way back to critical realist thought. And of course, in speculative realism, which I mentioned quite a bit in the book, if you go back to whether Manuel Delander or Herman Graham's work, they all went back to some of Roy Basker's writing on theory of reality and so on and so forth. So it's in that spirit that the talk of causality, causal mechanism, will bring you back to some of the critical realist thinking. But I don't really subscribe to certain kind of critical realist work that is not really the kind of my cup of tea. But having said that, I do have to admit that critical realism is actually very big outside geography. Right? They have annual conferences, there are journals devoted to it, there are many books published, like 40, 60 books in the Routledge book series. So it happens independent of the fact that geography will abandon critical realism, so to speak. Or as Graham Herman mentioned that nowadays, if you say you are a critical realist, it's like you admit you are what's that, child molester or something like that. It's quite bad, name-wise. So I dare not say I'm a critical realist. I don't know what John and Alan will say next week when I see him in the UCL meeting. But the point is that this book is not about critical realism. first. Second is to say whether the existing approaches do look into mechanistic explanation, maybe not. I also don't want you to think whenever we mention this word mechanism, that then you will think of this kind of knowledge as what we call mechanistic, so to speak. No, it's not. The thinking of, if you think of Deleuze's most used, one of the most used term called machine, is also, one may argue, a machine is mechanistic too, right? Although it's an English translation. I don't know what it's in French, but the word machine, which is probably more than 1,000 times used in 1,000 Plateau, the book, is also implying certain kind of parts and components of an organic entity. So it's in that sense that I wanted to use this book's opportunity to clarify what mechanism, causality might mean if you want to build explanatory theory. And I also hope perhaps really I need to call back, do a global callback of the book now to clarify. This is like, the product goes wrong and, the car brake doesn't work. We need to call back and fix some of the, at least hopefully minor things that all of the approaches I've already talked about so far, whether here or in the book, they are extremely important in their own right for all kinds of reasons Ash mentioned. Partly because many of them are responding to much earlier either deterministic approaches or much sort of grander theories which fail to address many of the ethical and or normative issues in the world. And for that reason, that's why we add the word post, right? Post-phenomenology, post-humanism, post-structuralism, and so on and so forth. So I think what I can say at this point is to say that hopefully, you will read this in a way that, how do I put it, is more meant to be complementary rather than sort of dismissive of the earlier. But I know, because you have pulled some of those lines which I mentioned, which upon reflection, perhaps I should not say it that way to make it less kind of overly or excessively critical. No, actually Ben mentioned earlier when we walked down, a more interesting way of putting it is to say, I had some, stinging shots, is it? Or angular elbowing while you're reaching out to my hand. All right. I will take back the elbow. So,
I think so much of this question rests on the distinction or the difference made by mechanism vis-a-vis process thinking and vis-a-vis other forms of relational thought, and I think that's in some ways the nub of this issue. There's a question at the back there, then a question from Andreas, and then Rach.
So I have a similar question, I guess, which is about about the connection you see between theory and emancipatory action, because I think that actually a lot of the grand theories and stuff that you say have failed, and all of these theories that are inadequate in some way have actually been the most key drivers of revolutionary movements and radical movements worldwide. And in that sense, it's I feel when because when I think about what theory is useful and that kind of stuff, it's what are people on the ground using? What are they saying? Why has there never been a revolution about new ontology? Why is it why is it certain things and not others? And I feel I don't know, that's that I just feel that's an important thing to think about in terms of
I think some of the theories, if I think of feminist theory, for obvious reason, it's extremely important in many ways. So when we talk about feminist theory, which is always in singular, not feminist theories, is that the whole idea of whether the label itself can galvanize people who are extremely concerned with gender inequality in the world, can help to, if you really induce political action, social movement, and so on and so forth. Right? So I think in that sense, the theory has outlived its own epistemological power, so to speak, to actually produce real world change, right? Through, of course, people who don't necessarily see it as a body of theory, but as practices, as thinking. So, and I don't have really issue with that in particular. But on the other hand, I just want to argue also that perhaps the political action aside, you also want to be able to provide guidance to how political action can be most effective in certain kind of contexts. And for that, you probably need to find out if you like, the mechanics of the wrongdoings, so that then the interventions can be done, if you like, in the most, or at least more effective. And for that, you probably need more explanatory theories than theories which are kind of radical in claim, but not necessarily explanatory in nature. I don't mean, of course, feminist theory in itself is not explanatory. Yeah? There are some, they are not, and in the book I've gone into some, some of the feminist theories, but it's not, of course, it's not possible for one book to cover feminist theory, or nor post-colonial theory for that matter. I'm just using this in an illustrative way to make the case that theory in itself, even though it's extremely influential in emancipatory action, perhaps we still need to think beyond that, to go back to what theory in itself is about.
Okay, it almost takes us back to Colin's question about how do we judge the practical adequacy of a theory, what kind of timescales do we judge, and what criteria do we bring to bear upon that. Andreas, then Rachel.
Henry, thank you for giving us the space for having this conversation.
Yeah.
I really liked it when you said that it was an opportunity to speak back. So I wanted to hear more from you about the being based in Asia and speaking back to the Anglo world, particularly around the ways in which that informed the making of your arguments. And one of the reasons why I ask is because I engage a lot with Latin American scholars. I am Latin American and I'm based here. And in our engagement, there is a huge interest in speaking through, across, not necessarily back, and when I talk to them, they scream more ontology, less epistemology. And I hear that in your case is the other way around, more epistemology, less ontology. And after all, explaining is a way of encountering the other. So I just want to hear more about how your position informs the speaking back.
Yeah, I think this is a very important question, which of course, as I mentioned earlier, I only kind of reflect on this towards the last part of the book. Partly because, although that is my little project, personal, kind of, decentering Anglo-American geography from the beginning when I first started in Manchester, it's a long journey. So in that sense that this book in itself cannot tell that full process, full practice. Yeah? But since you asked, so first I just want to say, when I say less ontology, more epistemology, means thinking about our theory, is that I tend to think of ontology as a belief, meaning that why is it that your ontology is as good as mine and hers and his, is that there is no way we can test ontology. Ontology is our theory of nature. Whether this is a computer, you may say it's just some quantum particles, so on and so forth. So it's in that spirit that I thought, ontology can only take us so far. Although it's true that your belief of a certain ontology or ontologies can shape how you theorize the kind of practice you will bring to the field, and hence dramatically change your research practices as well. It's possible. But on the other hand, because ontology in itself is a kind of, how to put it, is really the thinking space. I mean, you don't go out to study ontology. Ontology is what you do when you think, read, write, right? So it's in that sense that I argue for less ontology, more epistemology. However, going back to your original question, how to speak back. Now, in the book, in the chapter 6, I was speaking back to what was generally called globalization debate, and some of the authors, Ash and others have participated in this during the 1990s era and since then. So my sort of bigger intervention is not this book. Actually, it's in the other kind of stuff I've written in relation to how economic globalization can be understood, and how prevailing theories of globalization and, if you like, how globalization takes place in different parts of the world can be understood differently if you are theorizing about globalization from a different perspective. In my case, from a kind of Asian perspective, because Asia got involved in globalization in a particular way, so to speak. So if you like, Asia become part of the global economy in a kind of very different way as compared to, say, Latin America. And hence, of course, Latin American countries have always been taking a much more dependency, right, view of globalization vis-a-vis Asia. Asia tends to see less as a dependency, means extraction by the core, tends to be more beneficial way, so to speak. So it's in that sense I sort of took the opportunity to speak back to dominant kind of economic geography. That's really my main field. So I mentioned that, I explained that in that chapter. So that's where I'm talking about. So speaking back, it's not this book per se. It's actually the actual research work that I've been doing.
Thanks very much. I thought you might be interested in my reaction to reading the first chapter, because it took me back to a particular time. So I'm in Edinburgh in the 90s. I'm reading Derek Gregory, I'm reading David Harvey, and I'm bringing my newly honed feminist geography skills to the fore, and I'm critically engaging with those texts. And so I find myself doing the same to yours in a good, generous way. I'm counting how many references to feminist geography in the index. There's 17 out of 300. I'm looking at the index and I'm looking at, there's only one subsection on feminist geography. And I'm saying this because it's making me think about the linearity of the histories of the discipline that takes you to this point where you write the book. And I'd be really interested to hear your reflections on how that linearity has led you to write in this way, and there might be alternative trajectories that could have taken you in different directions. So that's kind of my first question, or comment really. But the other thing that I'm really interested in is your audiencing and mode of address. Like, I was really struck by how you slip between the I and the we. So you're very assertive and even use the word positionality up front, indebted of course to feminist geographies, that you can even do that in a theoretical book. So the I comes in, but then when you talk in terms of asserting a particular mode of theorisation, the we comes in. And I was started thinking, am I in that we, or is that a different kind of we, or actually I'm just overly thinking this? But it really matters to me, because I think, who do I bring with me on my theoretical journey? So who are you bringing with you, and are you trying to kind of bring us with you, or does that not even matter? So, but thank you, because you made my brain work.
I know what you mean.
Yeah. So.
No, I think it's a very interesting not alternative, but very, very kind of really opening up new dimension of how I should think about the way I write about this. I did not think as much, to be fair, in terms of how the I and V might be read, to be fair. And hence, it's great you have read it that way. Again, if I get a chance to revise it, I got to go back to every I and V that I use.
Oh no, don't do that. But it's interesting though. That's, and I think reading it through a feminist lens, that's what you've become attentive to.
I do understand that I and V will be read in terms of the positionality, whether in relation to literature or in relation to me, I myself. But going back to your original, your first point is that. One of the referees thought feminist geography has not appeared enough in the earlier manuscript. I think it's a fair statement. I had to make certain choices. So I could only focus on, in fact, as you have seen, actually in chapter 2, the choice I focused was on, say, Judith Butler's work, on Hope's book work, and on some others. So I went back to only a few of the original feminist theorists. And of course, in human geography, there are very wide-ranging feminist work done. And of course, Colin, because Deborah couldn't make it, I was really hoping Deborah will give me the hammer in the RGS, Deborah Dixon.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and now I'm banging on Mona Domush to do so in Hawaii, because I have another AMC, and Mona is my critic in Hawaii AAG. So let's see, and she should give me a full-blown feminist critique in this book. So, but I completely agree with you that there must be some slip in my use of I along the way, because there must be occasions when I didn't think explicitly about it when I use it.
Yeah.
So I now you open up my brain by a big margin.
Oh,
It's because it's many mentioned, so I will think much more about it. Yeah, but thank you very much.
I will try to kind of connect some points raised by Sarah and Colin, but also like some bits around the messy middle of theory making around raised by Harriet and Rachel's point on positionality, whether to see whether you have something to say perhaps around the role of not so much of like theory as such or theory on the ground in interface with real movement, but almost on researcher subjectivity. So like the practical and material condition under which actually theory is produced inside of the academia. For example, Sarah was pointing out the fact that Gramsci has a specific approach around researcher subjectivity that kind of perhaps moves away from the activist scholar and towards the organic intellectual, that then produces a specific type of theory praxis alignment. But Gramsci also had quite a lot to say around the fact that under new socioeconomic conditions, theory making should be collective, and so there is to some extent a disruption of the unitariness of the thinker and the idea that either the party or probably a post-capitalist kind of university is a collective intellectual, and this kind of brings us to the question of the we. I wonder whether the issue around that Colin kind of like picked up on, around the fragmentation of theory, then doesn't become so much a problem as such, or a problem or an opportunity as such, but whether it should be analyzed to what extent that enables or disables and kind of fosters either neoliberal forms of like super strong emphasis on the individual intellectual that then uses fragmentation of theory to gain a unique edge, or collaborative form of theory making that then uses multiplicity of theory to bring connections rather than to bring fragmentation. Because to me, I mean, this is partially an aside, but I always feel there is a weird way of like having a sense of jealousy towards, for example, physical geography, when papers there have 35 authors, when in human geography that draws on post-structuralist theory that theoretically should have been born around the death of the author, all the papers have one or two authors at tops, and papers are valued as such, for example, in hierarchy processes. So to what extent a book around theory should also be a book around the researcher subjectivity that kind of like reflects on which kind of form of unitariness or fragmentariness of theory making fosters or doesn't kind of forms of like either neoliberal or post-capitalist form of academic subjectivity, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. I think, okay, so first, this question of research subjectivity has not been explicitly addressed, and hence, thank you for bringing it up. I will say any theory we know of, even though the authorship, at least in the kind of theory we read, the authorship tends to be either primarily singular or at most double, hardly triple, if you like. So, and that is the kind of norms and practices of our academic activities. But we know very well ideas are widely shared. So really, even though the authorship is singular, but actually that theory must have embraced a wide-ranging body of ideas and what. So, and hence the phenomenon you've just outlined is more perhaps a kind of, I don't know, intellectual property right expediency rather than the true fact. The true fact is all theories are based on tremendous amount of work done by many other people, including, I mean, to write this book, it's not possible to just write out of the top of your head, right? So, and in my own theory development, I mean, in global production network theory, it's very much collaborative with Neil Cole and others from then Manchester and so on and so forth. So in a way, it is hard to think of a singular author theory, I say. But I think we do have, I mean, many of us have a kind of, either general tendency or preference when we make use of a certain theory to refer back to that person, even though we know it's not the person alone, to have done that theory, so to speak. So it's in that sense that to me this reflects our epistemic practice. This is like we are a community of practice here, right? So it reflects on our own doing. However, the science papers you're referring to, that's of different nature. I don't think those are multi-author ones, are not really theory papers. They're just big projects and of normally the third week. I mean, because I'm pretty familiar with benchmarking, so we only count the first and last author, not anybody. We may have 100 authors, but we only count the first and last, and the corresponding author. So, but that is the nature of the project, funding-wise, or sometimes exploitation, because the principal investigator holds the grant, so the name is always the last one. Yeah. But I won't go into great details because they are not really theory paper per se. But for our kind of theory thing, we tend to think of tradition, tend to think of the person, and hence it's technically actually quite unfair. Yeah, it is. I accept that. Yeah.
Okay, we've got a question from Joe. Another
Joe,
question
yeah.
Joe.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Henry. It's a fascinating discussion. My question is about some of the distinctions you draw, perhaps draw too sharply. So one would be between epistemology and ontology. I mean, it seems to me that by asserting that explanation involves the identification of mechanisms, you're making an ontological claim about how the world works in terms of its and what exists in the world, that there are things called mechanisms and that we can identify them, and if we do, we have explained something. So it's not clear to me that you can kind of downplay ontology in that sense, or foreground epistemology without creating kind of some kind of ontological problems for yourself. And then also between explanation and description, the original meaning of explanation was not to account for, but was to make clear. And a lot of work in description, I think, and also interpretation and understanding is really about making clear, including, not least, a lot of the kind of knowledge that was created that led to kind of feminist turn, led to a lot of kind of feminist insights, comes from making clear what gendered relationships are like, what gendered relationships are like within the household, within the family, and so on. And that's a making clear. That's revealing something that was previously hidden, and that then produces a lot of kind of theoretical, political, and cultural work, I think. And then the same thing could be said about the kind of lack of a sharp distinction between explanation and description. Is even if you go with your claim that causal explanation involves identifying mechanisms, why is that more than describing the nature of the mechanism? Isn't causal explanation simply just another form of description? You're just describing something else.
Thanks, Joe. The 2 points are both valid. I think it's fair to say. The distinction between, say, ontology, epistemology, and then explanation and description. Now, maybe I think with the second one first, is to say, and hence now sort of bring me back to Colin's, I think probably second point is that in the book, at least intentionally, I wanted to make this distinction to say there are theories which are not claiming explanation in terms of its explicit remit. So I make that distinction without at least wanting to claim that theorization doesn't entail description. To me, description is based, it has to be done. There is no way we can do any knowledge accumulation and production without description. Not possible. Anything we do is description. But whether description is explanatory, require another round of activity known as, in this case, causal thinking. So going beyond description require causal thinking, basically. Yeah? Or rephrase, to be explanatory, you need to think of causality and hence causal powers and emergence and so on and so forth. And hence, even though or at least some parts of the book you may see as too sharp a distinction, I just want to clarify one more time that description is necessary, except it's not sufficient in terms of an explanatory theory. And description is always there, has to be done. And hence, actually, methodologically, I always advocate thick description myself in what I actually do. I like to write more, describe about something, about the Apple chips that is done by Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, So I hope you get a feel of, at least, I don't really think that it should be that sharp a distinction. Ontology and epistemology, tricky, this is tricky. It's true that the acceptance of causal mechanism as a necessary tool for explanatory theory development entail almost acceptance that you think of nature or events and social spatial events and processes can have that kind of, if you like, the mechanism of how certain happening can be traced back to certain kind of emergence, and that process we eventually specified it to become a mechanism. So in other words, it does entail some assumption, and hence ontological thinking. And hence I think it's fair to say you cannot avoid ontology completely. It's just that I would like less ontology. Not to say no ontology, it's not possible. Again, anything we say here has a certain assumption of our own ontological belief. Except that I do want to make clear that ontology is almost like our belief. You know, if you are social constructivist, then you're almost by definition don't believe in anything that exists outside the human mind, right? Because that's what social constructivism is about, and so on and so forth. So I do agree that perhaps that distinction has to be borne in mind, that it cannot be so sharp. I completely accept whether it's a critique or accept your reading as this. And I hope not to make it as if it's meant to be so distinct. Yeah, it can be my fault. Yeah. My English is not very good, you must understand. I started learning ABC at 11 years old, as I mentioned in one of the endnotes. So anything, it's because English is not my first language. Sorry, I'm just taking a convenient excuse. It's my fault. It is my fault.
Okay, I feel like we're getting to the end of discussion. We'll have one final quick question, if you would like.
Right. Yes.
I was just wondering if you could speak to your omission of method here, because David Harvey's book was set up very explicitly. He talked about theory, then he talked about explanation, then he talked about the methods that would get you to those explanations that would get you what he deemed as like a good theory, which I assume is something that you would want to discuss here, but maybe relational thinking is the method you're speaking about, or yeah, if you could just speak to the methods that you omitted.
Okay. I still think that so first of all, the book is not about at least the word methodology.
Right.
Because some of us read the word method as about thinking. So it's possible that you read this as a method to theory, but it's not about methodology, research methodology, so to speak. However, I also don't believe that there can be a cookbook to theory, because this is more about how each of us internalize thinking as we read, think, and write in our own career, personal choices. So I hope this book doesn't give you a sense that, oh wow, he's preaching a particular way of doing theory. That's it, I just follow. Theory will come out. No, it's not like that. It's not possible. Because it's all by our own, how much you read, what make you think, and hence you make certain choices, whether tactical or strategic, doesn't matter, it's your own personal preference, or pure intellectual. And hence, I'm afraid there is no one way to do theory. Yeah. I mean, it's not, actually that is a good news. If there is only one way to make theory, like neoclassical economics, a discipline that I don't want to be in, then the world is black and white. The world is not black and white, I'm afraid. And that makes our life beautiful. Actually, that means we have business to do. So it's in that spirit, I hope we embrace the diversity of theories. I just hope one kind is explanatory. That's all I'm asking for. Thank you.
And I think this turns into tension in some ways, isn't it? Whether it's an argument for one kind of theory in the midst of multiple types of theory which have their own normative commitments and their own orientations and their own aims,
right.
Or whether it's an argument for one type of theory to kind of dominate. Like I think that's the tension which is drawn out in some ways in the discussion.
Yeah. Thank you.
Let us thank Henry for giving us the opportunity with the work to discuss these things, but also giving us the pleasure of agreement and disagreement, and responding with characteristic generosity to the disagreement which has been kind of staged in this room, but also the kind of our own collective engagement with Henry in the project of thinking what theory can do. So thank you, Henry.